Okay, greetings and welcome everyone. We are here Monday, September 18th, 5:31 p.m. This is our committee meeting for learning and teaching. And so with that, I would like to call to order. I believe we have no citizens comments, correct, Mrs. McCabe? So no citizens comments for today. Before we get into our for discussion items, I just want to tee off a little bit of an update regarding our last meeting where we had some robust discussion regarding SAT and expectations. So we'll be bringing some updates. There were some offline conversations, further discussions with board members and administration. And we'll be bringing some updates for everybody at that October 10th regular meeting of the board. Anything to add there, folks? No. So without further ado, we will go to item 2A for a boundary update.
As the board knows, and as we continue to keep our community updated, we're in the midst of the boundary process. A lot of that early work, some of that early work will be coming to the board table regarding the guiding principles and the criteria. That will be facilitated on September 25th with RSP. They'll be zooming in and having that conversation with the board. Administration will bring a recommendation, but that evening will be an opportunity for the board to review both the principles and the criteria. Those will be given back to RSP. The principles will be used by RSP as really the guidepost to how they start thinking about the boundary line. So that's a really important aspect that the board will be giving to RSP. The criteria is what the board will use to make the final decisions. So that's on October 10th. And there'll be work going on through RSP. But one of the pieces that RSP needs to finalize is that we requested an updated version of the demographics report that they brought back to us last year. And that's really important to make sure that we have the newest divisions that are being built, all just making sure that our data is right where we need it to be. So they'll be going through that process. They'll be updating all of our demographic data. And then they'll start working through different scenarios that will be brought forward to the community on November 28th and 29th. There will also be a survey given out at that time. And that's an opportunity for our community, for our staff to give feedback on the different scenarios. I don't know if they're going to bring 2, 3, 4, 5, however many scenarios they bring forward, but that'll be an opportunity for our community to engage in that process. So that's kind of where we're at currently, but some of the biggest work is coming up right now. Like I said, September 25th and then October 10th for the principles in the criteria.
Yeah, and to echo Paul's points there, we really want to hear from the community. We've received a lot of emails, communication, folks coming up here for public comment. We genuinely value your input, and there's a lot of good ideas circulating around there, and we welcome that. So please continue to keep that coming. Okay, next on the agenda, item 2B. Oh, I'm sorry. We're going to go into the presentation. My mistake.
We want an update, yeah.
I'm good.
No problem. So I just wanted to give you an update on where we are as we work through the boundary, particularly as we're working through the Davis-Richmond question that had been asked to us. So tonight, what our goal is really is to update the Board of Education on the family and staff feedback sessions that we had, then answer any additional questions that you may have or that you would like us to investigate before we come back with a recommendation on October 2nd. As we get started, just as a reminder, we've really kind of grounded the work that we are doing as it relates to boundaries aligned to this commitment statement of together building pathways to excellence. And we're leaning into those core values of belonging, perseverance, and achievement to help us grow, help us make those decisions. In addition to that, aligned to those commitment, we also have strategic priorities. And you have seen when we put out the minimum space standards, we've really leaned into what is it that we need to have in place in order to allow us to do the work and meet those expectations that we've outlined in the strategic plan. So we're leaning into these strategic priorities to help us kind of move along. Just kind of a reminder of where we are. The master facility plan work started back in 2020. And we went through and we kind of organized some of our thinking, and we decided there are some things that are urgent. And those urgent pieces was the overcrowding of our schools and a lack of equitable learning experiences for students. We're kind of in that second part of the urgent, where we've made some decisions about what we need to do in terms of our buildings. And now we're really engaging in that conversation as it relates to new boundaries and what that means. So in that first stage, we decided that we needed to repurpose Fox Ridge from an EC center into an elementary school. And with that, we now need to talk about how do we move boundaries to ensure that we fill all of our classrooms. Conversation really around the grade level centers in Davis Richmond really does come back to RSP asking for some clarification from us in regards to how did we want to proceed in terms of those grade level centers. We had originally planned to make a recommendation this evening, and we had received feedback that people needed a little bit more time and we needed to engage our community just a little bit more. So this timeline kind of plays out for you where we're at. We're at that September 18th, where we're going to provide some feedback, and that we added a special L&T meeting on October 2nd so that we could come back with that committee recommendation. So this is different than the last time that we were here sitting at the table. As we get in, I just want to put some background information so that we're all kind of working from the same place. As we started, you heard me earlier talk about the problem that we're trying to solve is really overcrowding within our elementary schools. That's resulted in those inequitable learning experiences for students. We're really talking about art, music, and empower. And we're also talking a little bit about the impact of cap and send. So we've talked about when we actually have buildings that don't have the ability to add another classroom, no matter how many students they have. And sometimes we're sending many students to schools outside of their boundaries. So that was really the problem that we were working with. And as we identified this problem through the facility master plan, we then engaged with RSP to help us put together an enrollment study and a capacity study. So that's really kind of where we're at. When we had RSP come in and provide us with some just general information about our capacity of our buildings and our enrollment, one of the things they said to us is that you first really need to give us minimum standards. We need to know and understand how you want to use your space so we can make some determinations about what that functional space will look like. And that's really where we leaned into those strategic priorities around wanting to make sure we had enough collaboration, that we had classrooms, that we were able to respond to open enrollment over time. So once we set those minimum expectations, RSP took that information back, redid the functional capacity, and came back to us with, and here's what we've got. If you were to keep your boundaries as they are and meet these minimum standards, we would have 6 schools that were over capacity. We would have 2 schools that were right where we need them to be, and that we would have 3 schools that were under capacity, which is how we came to this conversation as it relates to, we really do need to make some adjustments to our boundaries in order to make these things work. As we're thinking about that problem that we're solving and that overcrowding and putting those minimum standards in place, you've seen this slide before, but it's always good for us to kind of come back and take a look. That this really tells us what do we need across the district to support our functional capacity of our elementary schools. And we really need 269 classrooms to make that work. And our inventory, when we add in Fox Ridge and we take Lincoln out, is that we have 276. So you can see that we're very close in terms of what we need to what we have available to us. Once we had a really clear understanding of what those pieces are in terms of enrollment, we really needed to then, RSP came back and said, so what we like to do is for you to tell us where you want your specialized program. So if we look back here, we see we've got 23 classrooms for district programs. So they really asked us to stop and think about where would we place those programs, because what they will do is once we place those programs, they'll build the boundaries around. They'll assume that those 2 classrooms or 3 classrooms that we're using are filled, which makes sure that we have the space that we need to support students and that we're creating kind of a long-term solution and we're not moving students around the district based upon that space. when we put these things in, as we're working through this, we're really thinking about, we want to make sure programs have a partner, right? One of the things that we've really said is important to us as a district is this idea of collaboration. And while we believe 3 makes the perfect collaboration, there are places where only 2 are possible. And so wherever is possible, we want to make sure we don't have anybody on an island. So we want to make sure that we've paired people up, whether that's in our specialized programs or whether that's in our dual language program. And so as we think about that dual language program, we will continue to be able to provide that dual language program, and we will work to make sure that those classrooms are together. So that whether it's cross grade level configurations or all in one building, we will make sure that dual language is connected so that we aren't separating them throughout the district. So as we kind of walk into our conversation tonight, the idea of dual language is not the purpose of our conversation. It really is kind of thinking big picture about how do we place our programs, and then how do we make sure we have capacity in our buildings. As we think about, because this is going to come up later, I want to make sure I talk about this, the idea of putting dual language into a singular building, that would really be about changing the model from 3 sections to 4 sections. So we'd have a 4-section school, and that would be 2 sections of monolingual and 2 sections of dual language. Got a lot going on here, lots of numbers. So as we sat back and we thought about, so what does that mean if we're going to move to 4 sections, right? We're going to do a building. We thought we need to really think about what does that mean for space so that we can think through that. So if that first column you see there is really K-5 with a dual language in one building. In order to make 4 sections work, we would need 24 core classrooms, 2 non-core classrooms, and we would work from the presumption of we wouldn't have any repurposed classrooms, which brings us to a total of 26 classrooms that we would need. So we then went and looked at our inventory of classrooms across our schools, across the district, to say who has buildings that could possibly have 26 classrooms in them. So we've got up there that have them. I'm going to indicate that we've got Davis up there, but I want to put in the caveat of, right, we need 3 non-core classrooms at Davis because Empower cannot sit in the LRC. So we need to identify that, whereas in many places it can. At Davis, that's not. And that those repurposed classrooms where we have 6, those really are the mobiles that we're talking about. So just knowing that that's how those numbers are coming to be as we're playing through each of those pieces. But we're currently looking through each of those to say which of these makes the most sense. What are the advantages and considerations to how we would place those programs kind of moving forward. We then just took some time to do some high level, like if we were to maintain Davis, Richmond, those grade level configurations, what would be the advantages and the considerations that we need to have in place? I think it's really important that as we're walking through this, that there are advantages and considerations no matter what we do, and that we're really weighing them out, and that we're going to have to make some compromises somewhere. There is no perfect solution to what we're trying to accomplish. But really maintaining those buildings does support and reinforces the sense of community that's been built over time. And that's pretty strong. And we'll talk about that in our feedback as well. It does allow some of our specialists to really concentrate and support across less grade levels, which really allows them to kind of fine tune some of those skills. And I think this is an important one as we sit and think about the change that we have in the upcoming year. It does provide more consistency for students, staff, and families throughout that process. Some considerations would be that there'd be underutilized spaces within Davis. So when we think about how Davis and Richmond is currently one boundary, right? One school has 31 classrooms, one has 21 or 25, 26 classrooms and 21 classrooms, right? One school is larger than the other. So when we put those boundaries in place, we can really only put boundaries in place that support the smallest school. So when we do that, that would mean only 18 core classrooms at any given time, which means there's leftover rooms at Davis. If we think back to where we were at the beginning, when I said we needed pretty much all of our spaces, right? If we then decide we're going to use those classrooms at Davis while they're split, that means we are really leaning into our specialized programs, right? We would need to put a specialized program in there. And the considerations that we need to make sure that we really think through when we do that is those are students that are sitting in a K-2 building that don't have all the benefits of transition and support that the other students get when they go from second grade to third grade, because there isn't room at Richmond for those students to move there. So those students would then need to go to another elementary school that isn't meeting and kind of transitioning kids typically at that time. So they're leaving people and friends that they know, going to a new place. So we just need to weigh all of that out. And when we're talking about specialized programs, we're typically talking about students where transition is more difficult. So we just need to think through and process all of those things. And that another consideration is that additional 2nd to 3rd grade transition that other students do not have. We'd return to K-5 buildings. What that would allow us to do would be increase that vertical alignment and instructional cohesion. When we talk about we would allow us to effectively use some of our district resources to support some of that dual language program. There would be no additional transitions, and then we would be be able to use all of our buildings, like fully utilize those buildings. Considerations is that there's no room to accommodate growth at any one given grade level. So one of the things we talked about was wanting those repurposed classrooms so that we could bump out, like kids don't come to us in nice, easy, they don't come to us in groups of 60 or 75, right? So sometimes we need to bump, but this would put us in a spot where that would be difficult to do. It does definitely impact our minimum kind of thinking as it relates to PLCs, right? So we had said 3 teachers in a PLC is really what we need. And for ELA, because the ELA looks different for our dual language, we would be in a spot where we're only doing 2. So we would be making a compromise in that situation. And that it would also produce more change for students and staff and families in a year when we know there's significant change occurring. All right, I'm going to turn it over. Talk about some family and staff feedback.
Yeah, and excuse me. And since our last time at the board table, we did hold some staff and family engagement opportunities. On September 6th and 7th, we held 2 parent family engagement meetings, one on a Wednesday evening, one on a Thursday morning. And then last Friday, we held a staff engagement opportunity with the Davis and Richmond staff. And so at both of those presentations, we tried to just start by defining the problem. And again, the problem is we're trying to kind of minimize the overcrowding in our elementary schools across the district. We had kind of a similar approach in both presentations, gave a little bit of a background on why Davis and Richmond are grade level centers in the first place. Gave a little bit of research behind transitions. We did ask for questions in advance from our parent community, and we took some time with them to answer those questions, then engaging Q&A with them. And then a part of the staff presentation last week is we had summarized and synthesized the parent feedback to just provide to the Davis Richmond staff as well. Again, I'd say just like what we would have expected, our parents and staff, highly engaged, highly passionate, very respectful, just really good engagement and very thoughtful about the questions they were asking and the things and considerations that they would want us to hear. For each one of those engagements, we asked for some form of feedback, specifically in the form of these 2 anecdotal questions. So the first question you see up here is, what would you like the administration and Board of Education to consider when making this decision about grade level centers? And just to be clear, what you're looking at here is this is the parent engagement feedback. On the left, you will see that 32 parents attended in person, and then 89 parents submitted a form who were not able to attend the feedback session, but they were able to attend, or they were able to view the presentation and then submit a subsequent survey. But you definitely see some themes in here of strong feelings about having the schools remain as grade level centers, yet you also see some of the respondents said that they would really be interested in going back to that K-5 model as well. But you definitely see that passion in the types of experiences they want their students to have, and that maintaining diversity that came out as one of the top ones for both the parents in person and the parents just looking at this presentation itself. I'll give you a moment to look at some of the other factors that really came through in that survey.
I was going to add that a couple of us, the board members, were in attendance at each of the sessions. So I think Ms. McCabe, you were in the second day. Ms. Fairgrieve and I were in the first day. I want to share with the board a couple of the things that I heard. Some of the parents said, or one of the great quotes that I had was, place the programs before the boundaries, right? Look at the programs, and they appreciate the board is looking at the programs. I want my children to have some consistency there was some discussion about that as well. And then also logistically managing children in two different buildings when they're in the same thing was a challenge. There were also a lot of feedback about the dual language offering. And that's something too that I also heard from parents outside of Richmond Davis is Richmond Davis has this separate program that they have that isn't available to the rest of the district. So those were a couple of the big ones that we heard as well. And then transition. There was concern about, okay, that my child has already transitioned now from Davis to Richmond. And now they're going to be transitioning back potentially to Davis. And then they're going to be transitioning again to middle school. So again, there's no kind of right answer when we were talking about it in the sessions, right? But it was certainly some feedback that we got. I'm curious if there was any other themes that you guys saw on the second day.
There was a lot of passion. The diversity issue came up. There were more questions, I think, than opinions as to what to do. There was a little bit of a surprise that we were going to a shorter day. That wasn't clear to the families who were there. Again, the conversation about FLES, that was explained by administration that has dropped because of what had to happen during COVID. And then when Empower came in. So that I think the presentation was done very well. It gave a lot of detail and information that I think helped people as they were trying to put together. I came away with kind of an emotional, positive feeling that after the history of putting these two buildings together, how this community came together. And even I've seen even the people who spoke about I'm calling it decoupling it and putting them back to K-5. It wasn't because they didn't like the setup. It was more for convenience. My children are at two different buildings. So there has been a great sense of community that's been put together. And that came out in the conversation with the parents. But there was some pretty strong feelings about the need to maintain the diversity that Richmond Davis has. And that they love their schools. So
yeah, and you'll definitely see that on the next slide. The last question we asked the parents was, regardless of configuration, what academic and climate experiences do you hope are preserved? And you can see throughout the summary of the feedback, there are so many that go back to that exact thing: diversity, sense of community, diverse, inclusive environments. It really does come back to it. And then you could see that our parents, they really do feel the community presence in the Davis Richmond School. And those components of that, the celebrations, the paw parties, the opportunities for leadership with, if we go to that K-5 setting, wanting to maintain those types of things because they've seen the benefit for their families and for their students.
Are some of those things that the Davis Richmond community has done things that we can distribute to the rest of the district? Are there any lessons learned, Jared, that you guys have seen from kind of actually looking at this at a deeper level that are being done at Davis Richmond that aren't being done at our other schools?
Well, I think there's a lot our schools could probably learn from Davis Richmond just because they've had to overtly tackle that. They have two buildings, they have students from families in multiple buildings. So the consistency of their communication, the consistency, they have one PTO, the desire to have these block parties and the desire to have these events designed to bring a community together. Not to say that schools aren't doing that, but I think that because of their unique circumstances and the legwork it took 10, 11, 12 years ago to really get joy pumped into these environments, to get optimism pumped into the environment, I think that just spread and it became something that the community expected and very highly attended.
And Well, I would also like to say, because I've been thinking about this, that when we closed Fox Ridge and when Wild Rose moved to Anderson, this community cares about community. And I don't want it lost on anyone, no matter what we decide, that transition to a new building, saying goodbye and welcoming, is a key component to what our families want and are looking for. And I believe our principals are taking that very seriously. I watched a lot of things happen when PTOs have to come together, and how they distribute their leadership and how they work through that. And I think that is a value of this community, that we know that whatever we decide, we're going to have a good portion of people who will hate us. Just is going to be that. But I think that if we keep clear that this community cares about how we transition children into their next chapter, and that becomes a priority as we make our decisions, I think is really critical for this board to take seriously.
And I'd like to piggyback on that comment too, because I think you're absolutely right, Mrs. McCabe. And hopefully the community sees that the complexity of these decisions is not lost on the board or the administration. And we're taking very careful consideration. We understand that this is going to impact a lot of people's lives, their day to day. It will likely impact our lives as well, for those of us who have kids in the community. So we just want you to know that the careful consideration that we're taking into this is because we know that it will impact you all. And we want to make sure that we're as delicate and as thoughtful as we can throughout this process.
Okay, last Friday, we did have an opportunity to meet with the Davis and Richmond staff, and that too was a very passionate, a lot of back and forth sharing of ideas, asking a lot of questions. One of the walkaway survey questions was very similar to that we asked of the parents. What would you like the administration Board of Education to consider when making this decision? And it won't take you long to kind of synthesize this feedback, and it goes back to the importance of maintaining diversity. That was definitely a thread that came through. You can also see this passion of, especially for those staff who have been there since the 2011, 2012, that the amount of sweat equity they have placed into growing these schools into what they are today, to making them be highly engaging, highly successful, highly sought after by their parents. The things that have actually come out within our district from the work done by the Davis Richmond staff, I think is absolutely something that needs to be noted. And so you see, some of the things that they see. When we talk about, regardless of the configuration, what experiences do you hope are preserved? And that's, again, you're going to see this collective commitment to kids, right? This collective commitment to community, that I want the people to my right and to my left to be all in when it comes to serving the students and the families in front of me. So when you read some of those bullet points, you definitely see, fostering that sense of community, preserving the unique focus on primary education, the amount of supports that with such a tailored approach to the grade level centers, they feel they're able to tailor the supports and the offerings to the students and the families, because that's the world they've lived in for the past decade, and the relationships they've grown with the community partnerships. So they feel very passionately about the different types of resources and access they can get our students and families to if they need that. And really, again, just working side by side with colleagues who are all in and ready for the hard work. Davis and Richmond, it hasn't always been the cool place to be. And it is really something that our parents have come to appreciate, and something that our staff has put so much time and effort into growing to something that our entire district could be proud of. And that definitely came through in the feedback. So let's just talk through next steps a little bit. We are going to, as we move towards making a recommendation on October 2nd, we need to continue to investigate the advantages and considerations within the buildings that are large enough to support 4 sections. And that was that slide that Christine showed a little bit earlier in the slideshow. We also need to continue to review and evaluate the feedback we receive from staff and families to determine if we need to make any adjustments to the advantages and considerations that we have within the option. For full transparency, the staff feedback closed, I believe, around midday yesterday. So we've definitely had about 24 hours to digest it. But we'd really like to spend some more time with that because the feedback was fairly robust. And then going back to our grade level centers engagement timeline. So we're giving you a follow-up today, knowing that we'll be back in 2 weeks to share our administration's recommendation, looking to take action on grade level centers on October 10th.
With that, what questions can we answer?
We'll open it up for discussion here, board. Any feedback or questions?
One question I do have, I want to make sure I understood what was said. It sounds like the kids are going to be going to, regardless of what occurs, kids are going to be going to other schools besides Richmond at that grade 2-3 transition. In other words, the kids coming from Davis, they're not all going to be necessarily going to Richmond at that transition.
I'm sorry, that's not what let me just clarify.
Okay, that's
I was talking about when we had the program, if we keep the system as it is, in order to fully utilize Davis, we would have to put specialized programs in there like we currently have.
right.
And the downside to that is that those students aren't able to transition to Richmond with all the other kids that they've been with for the last 2 years because there isn't room at Richmond. That's what I was trying to communicate.
Okay, so yeah, I guess that's, so were that the case, then that they would not all be going there then. It's the kind of
The kids in the specialized programs, yes.
Right. Okay. All right, I just wanted to understand. I wasn't
No, I
quite
appreciate it.
clear on that. So now I understand that a little bit better. All right, thank you.
I have a few questions. If we go to if we decouple and go to K-5, we've spent an enormous amount of time and resources with developing the skills of the teachers for teaching primary grade levels, as well as intermediate. Is there, in our process of moving, I would hope that that our process will include teacher voice as well about being where they place. But that K2 building has spent over a decade working on K2 instruction. Is it possible to be sure that those teachers who are in that primary can remain in primary so we can use the skills and knowledge they've gained?
Let me jump into that one. Marcy Conlin, our Chief Human Resource Officer, Jen Adam, the president of the Teachers Association, are working collaboratively to develop a process that will be shared with our staff as we go down this road. I can't guarantee anything, but what I can say is absolutely a teacher's background knowledge, their experiences, those pieces will be, considered in the process. But I'm really supporting that Marcy and Jen really, and they have been already, there's already been some work done there, but that they will bring that forward to myself and the cabinet and others as we go down this process. But there'll be a laid out process for all the transitions, because this process will also be used for other components throughout our district. As we know that each of our buildings will be impacted by the boundaries. So this will be broader than just the Davis Richmond, but Davis Richmond will definitely be in that consideration.
Okay, thank you. The other thing, I have a couple questions and then I think I'll be finished. I talked about PTOs, so I think that this is more so than any other, maybe Lincoln, but that parent leadership issue, the district, this is my opinion, the district doesn't really embrace district-wide PTO. They're kind of on their own. We are engaged in it, but I think that they're going to want, I know when we did put them together, there was a lot of work to make sure money, fundraising, communication. So I'm hoping that no matter what, consider that part.
Absolutely. So like I said, we will be thinking about like, 'cause that's, while it's definitely a Davis Richmond and it's more complicated there. But regardless of, we're going to have to be talking with all of our PTOs because we're going to be moving kids everywhere, you know what I mean? So we're going to have to be really leaning into that to really help make sure that we have a solid plan. But we definitely have it on the radar as an area that we need to make sure that we're thinking about and putting a plan together for.
Yeah, that was gonna be my add-on to that this isn't just Davis and Richmond. This is district wide and we need to arm the PTOs with the knowledge and incorporate them into a communication plan as soon as possible, especially with regard to the upcoming, feedback that we're going to want. Right. I think that's something that Paul, I'd ask you and the cabinet to come back. And as we're going to be pushing these things out, either some things to the PTOs, because those are the people who are in those buildings, who are working with the teachers as well as those local communities day to day. So I'd like to see that piece of it incorporated as well.
Absolutely. Actually, Scott Harvey and myself will be joining the district PTO meeting where we will give that update again, really giving out those dates around November 28th, 29th, the survey coming out on the 28th. How do we engage, but also a whole district wide communication, but absolutely engaging our district wide PTO.
I do remember when Fox Ridge was changed to early childhood, the district did a really good job of creating a system for where that PTO was distributed and not just the finances, but also the actual assets, things, decorations for things. And I think that they did a really good job with that. So however all of this lands, to your point, Tom, this is going to affect all the PTOs, and I know that it would be great to make sure that they feel supported and we lean into them as a resource with communicating with parents and trying to support that from all sides, meaning not just the community, but also for those each school leaning into the PTOs, I think is a key.
Thank you for that.
I have two more and then I'll be done. One of the things I took from the parent meeting, and this I think is across the board, and I'm not positive, but I think the kids who are in fourth grade are the ones right now that they're going to make a change and then they make another transition to middle school. And what I drew from the meeting was, no matter what you do, keep an eye on my kid.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And it isn't going to be 1 year. It could be 2 years of I'm getting kind of emotional about it. So as an organization, as a learning organization, whatever we can do to help those transitions. We've learned from COVID that kids are resilient, but they're not also.
Yeah.
And so we need to really keep that in mind. And I think I had a conversation with you, Dr. Igo, that you've already started.
We definitely have started thinking about and putting some things in place around the social emotional well-being and helping people through transition. And then the other piece to also think about that probably wasn't in place prior was this idea that we've been working towards this guaranteed and viable curriculum. So what we're doing in one place is, it's going to transfer in a way that maybe it hadn't transferred in previous years. So both of those things are going to be working in. We'll be working on both of those things to ensure, but I agree with you. I heard loud and clear. I need someone to make sure they've got their eyes on my kid and that if there needs something to be done, like you're on it. And so we are definitely thinking about how do we make sure that happens.
I think sorry.
Go ahead.
I think it would, to your point about COVID, I think that might make sense to be looking at the transition, the kids that are making an additional transition, maybe looking at that as a cohort if possible. Now that might be super complicated. I'm not sure. I'm not trying to throw a whole bunch of work in your lap, but just as an idea that maybe that's something that we just keep an eye on.
Ms.
Absolutely.
McCabe, that you reminded me of one of the other comments from one of the parents at the listening session where she mentioned that when the board is looking at all the boundaries and looking for the middle school, taking into account that those kids at Richmond Davis as a cohort, making sure that they, you know, they transition together to a Thompson, right? Which is also some of the feedback that I've gotten, you know, in the community is, hey, those kids who are, you know, close in the area, right? Get them to the similar middle school, right? So that again, they reunite, they have those children that they've established friendships with, stormed and normed with, right? They're moving together as a community. So that was, I think, a good thing that you brought up there.
So my last question now is about building. So it isn't all the social emotional. So looking at the slide that you presented where we need 3 Empower classrooms or 3 rooms and Empower needs 1. And then we have 6 mobiles and we've just experienced the mobile issue. So now I'm a little confused. What is the and maybe you could come back with this. What's the future of Davis? It's not ADA. We don't like how it's set up with the library in the middle. And now we need 6 mobiles to make it.
Mhm.
So part of me is wondering, is it possible to talk more about the future of that facility? And not, and then that might make us rethink about what we need to do with the campus.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. In this situation right now with Davis, as you see the numbers and the need for the portables right now, that is the solution right now. The bigger conversation about the ADA accessibility at Davis, and I have to say Wild Rose as well, as I was just there today. Both of those buildings have significant ADA issues that need to be addressed at some point, but those are also significant dollars we're talking about. In those 2 schools, roughly, you're going to be close to $60 million to do something with those 2 schools based off of prior data from D303 that explored that. So those numbers could be old. Those numbers are old, so don't quote me on those, but it will be a significant investment to redo those because you're talking about literally accessibility to classrooms that are upstairs or on different flights. If you think about Wild Rose, it's hard to enter that building if you have mobility concerns. It just is. So we would have to look at both of those pieces. So short term, that's not what we have in our short term view of 2 to 5 years. But I absolutely believe there's got to be a conversation coming up with the board around that long term view, because even if the board and the community members harken back to when we spoke about our 5-year capital improvement plan. That plan itself for 5 years was roughly $50 million. And again, this is not the glitz and glamour. These are parking lots, sidewalks, roofs, infrastructure of HVAC and those types of pieces. So we have a lot of maintenance work to do as well as absolutely where you're at. So it's not a great answer, but we do believe we need those portables for now. At Davis.
So if I can ask, I really on the portables, it just jarred a question that I had a while back. What's the status right now with the use of those portables?
There's no one in the Davis portable, so we are working through solutions. What that is, Amanda Stuber, our executive director of facilities, is engaging different co-ops, engaging Wold to find a solution.
For the short term, what are we doing now with the programs that were housed within those mobiles?
This is, you talk to any Davis staff member, this is a huge stress on the Davis staff. There is significant impact that's occurring there because for a lot of the mobiles that were outside, it was housing our staff because there's no room. There's no offices. There's no place for our staff. We have 1 classroom. So it's a significant issue. We've transitioned those back into the building Jared's going to talk to you a little bit more about the specifics of it. But to say that any of this has been easy
No, I
would
can't- I
not
can't
be
imagine
true.
it has.
It's been very stressful, a lot of strain, a lot of adults on top of each other. I'm super proud of the Davis staff for what they've done, what they've overcome. And the hard part is we don't know the end date on that. But Mr. Buxton,
Yeah, as Dr. Gordon said, the Davis staff has been extremely resilient
Extremely.
because I believe it was the second day of school
Mhm.
when we got that call. And if you picture a school that houses the dual language program, 3 access classrooms, is a Title I school. It has a lot of additional staff that our other schools don't have. And so what the staff that was placed out in the mobiles, there was a music classroom. Then the other 5 classrooms were used for like office space, OT, PT, places to meet with small groups of students. What Mrs. Shaw and her amazing team did is they brought the music room into their staff lounge. So they gave up their staff lounge to have the music room. Mrs. Shaw gave up her office to be a conference room, and she moved into a smaller office. They closed the partition in the multi-purpose / cafeteria, and huge shout out to their custodial team and organic life team for turning around and cleaning really, really quickly to be able to feed all the students on one side of that in the multi-purpose room. And on the other side of that partition is the staff lounge and about 3 to 4 kidney tables where small group instruction can occur with the specialist. They also had like a smaller conference room that's more just like flex space for some of the displaced staff to have a home base. So-
Are there any other larger scale? I'm just trying to think, it's been a while since I've been in that building, but I mean, are they using the LRC for anything? Or are they?
every
They
state,
set up a couple, they set up a couple tables in the LRC for small group instruction, but just noticing that I believe there are 16 classrooms that you get to from the LRC. So it's a constant hallway. So not the best learning environment.
Yeah, do I know that?
The acoustics in that LRC are not the greatest for any kind of learning. That was some feedback that we got when we were doing facility master planning.
Yeah, well, it's an open classroom essentially. And that's.
I will assure you, every space is being overused.
Yeah,
So-
and
that
Mrs.
building.
Shaw, she's walked the building 400 times. She's thought partner.
Yeah.
Every space has been considered. And we're just really grateful for the staff because we know that's not how they wanted the start of their year to look. They had all these visions of the type of work and amazing things they'd be doing with students. And they've had to pivot a bit. But we do appreciate their flexibility.
Well, I'll move on to my other third rail question then.
Okay.
No, the dual language program that's currently housed at which we were talking about turning that into a true dual
Two-way.
language, two-way dual language, because it's not that right now. But is that something that is going to be practical to roll out district wide? Because if we're, my view is that if we're going to be doing dual language, it needs to be made available to everyone, not just to people who live in one certain area or attend one certain building.
So I think I'm going to ask that we maybe put that aside because that actually is going to come up a little bit later in another one of the things we're going to talk about in terms of how do we provide supports for EL students and what does that mean? But it's something that we are definitely looking into and we would bring back a plan for what that would look like.
Just for clarity on the number of classrooms, are we still in determination of, are we fully replacing? Like I remember the update this week, right? Are we going to replace the mobiles like for like, or I know there was originally a plan that it was going to be, smaller. And again, where are we leaning? Because from a cost perspective, if we're also talking about long-term investment with the building, where's administration leaning on this?
So we're a little bit all over the place because the costs are fluctuating all over the place. So we're engaging different groups around portables, new, gently used, and what it would look like to also refurbish. So we're not quite yet on a recommendation to the board. We should be shortly, but Amanda, who has been incredible, is really working that problem right now. And I'm hopeful we can have an update to the board sometime next week about where we're currently at. We may not have the exact solution, but we'll have at least an update.
Well, the one other question I did have is regarding the need. So in the current configuration, we obviously need the 6 mobiles.
Yes.
Were we in a K-5, what would be the need for mobiles? Would it be similar, more or less same?
Yes, similar there. Again, we have to really think about the placement of the dual language program. And that's why we have here are the schools that would be able to house the program, because you need a certain number of classrooms to do that. So we're working through all of those different pieces as we think about, as Christine said earlier, where do all of our programs go? And that's what RSP needs. RSP absolutely needs to know, where are we putting our different programs? And that's one of those programs that we need to make it. But for Davis, if it were to have the dual language program, it would need those mobiles.
Okay, some really good, robust discussion there. I want to take a second, though, to also just on behalf of myself, and I know I don't speak for the board, but I feel they feel the same way. Big thank you to the staff for their resilience and their creativity to deal with an immediate issue that I don't think anybody saw coming. So we know that that is not easy, and really thank you for that effort.
Yeah, I would also finish, with the families who came out for the evening session, the morning session, absolutely passionate. I think Mrs. McCabe, you nailed it. At the end of the day, take care of our kids. Take care of our kids. They absolutely offered their thinking and what they thought was the best for their children and what we should be doing. So I really appreciate people taking the time to come out and filling the survey out. To our Davis Richmond staff, what I heard on Friday night and in different occasions with the staff, they know their students. They know their students exceptionally well, and they care for their students, and they want what's best for their kids. They absolutely have worked tirelessly to make the Davis Richmond situation really work for kids. But absolutely, they care deeply. And I think that was one of the pieces that they made clear to us who were there. Make sure the board understands, yes, there's always numbers, but our kids are our kids, and we care deeply about our kids as they come to us. Who they are, they come to us, we open our arms and we welcome them in to Davis Richmond. Very passionate about the work they do, passionate about being a primary center or an intermediate center, really passionate about that work. And for many of them, they chose to work in those schools because they're a primary or an intermediate school. I just thank the staff. I know it was not the most convenient time as we had a water main break. We were supposed to be there on Thursday night. We get there on Friday night, but we still have a number of staff who show up because they're that passionate. They want to engage with us. So incredible kudos to our staff for offering and sharing their feedback and ideas. Christine, are we? All right.
Okay. So I guess keep the feedback coming. We really value it. Thank you. I think that takes us on to item 2B, and that's the high school experience scope of work. This is just regarding auditing the high school academic experience and those academic outcomes and creating some recommendations and an implementation timeline. Dr. Igo?
You got it. All right, we're going to talk a little bit about kind of the audit of that high school experience. And I want to be like, the purpose of us coming together, the purpose of us engaging in the conversation really is around this idea that you all set a goal for us. And it really was a goal around making sure we audited that high school experience, and we came back with some recommendations that support kids and supports kids and make sure that they're college and career ready. And you gave us some really clear deliverables, in terms of by November, you wanted us to be looking at some course catalog and some recommendations as it relates to that. You wanted us to be thinking about that math plan for 8th grade, in particular algebra. That in April, then you wanted us to come back to the board we were supposed to come to back in April with some recommendations for review and discussion. So what I really wanted to do was unpack this goal make sure that we all understand that goal and that we're in agreement that this is the work that you want us to do as we kind of step forward. Make sense? So really our outcome is around kind of reaching consensus on the purpose, the scope of the work, the key questions, the process, and those overall deliverables that you kind of asked for us. This idea that together building pathways, right? This is like at the heart of what this really means here is how are we putting our courses and our pathways together to ensure that our kids have what they need, that have a sense of belonging, that they're able to persevere and that they're able to achieve at high levels. So that's really how we're going to connect this work back. And it also really weighs heavily into some of our strategic priorities. And though it's going to weigh heavily into the one around instructional coherence. And so this is really a way for us to attack this idea of this guaranteed and viable curriculum, as well as evidence-based instructional practices and equitable systems of support. So this is an opportunity for us to take a deep dive into how are we organizing that high school experience to ensure that all of these things are happening for our students. So I want to start here based kind of upon some of that information. And I'm going to kind of stop us after each one and try to get some feedback to make sure we're on the right track here. You had in the packet, you had a charge statement that kind of outlined. I'm going to put all of it up here, but just in case you want to follow along. And Beth also just passed one out to you, in case you want to follow along there. But want to make sure that we've got the purpose down, because the purpose will then guide the rest of what we do, is that you're looking for us to recommend a cohesive and comprehensive academic high school experience that builds students' college and career readiness skills and results in measurable growth towards the district's success indicators as they relate to attendance, behavior, and content. Have I captured kind of the purpose of what you're hoping that we will accomplish?
I think when we started some of this conversation, there was a review of the AP program. We had a discussion about the course catalog as a whole.
Yeah.
And I think this reflects not only an expansion, but a more comprehensive view of that ask, which is, does the high school program today contain within it the right content and the right goals in order to help students succeed in the future? And, you know, when we consider the last time the entirety of the program was considered, I think we'll be looking back quite a ways. So it strikes me that it's inclusive enough of a goal statement to get after that ambition of saying, do we have the right high school experience?
Everyone feel good about that? All right, so kind of outlined what is all of the scope of the work that we wanted to do, and really start with kind of making sure we had a good understanding of what is the current state in terms of what are the course pathways that we have available, what is our course enrollment trends, so that we have an idea of what that is. And then I want to talk a little bit about alignment with potential careers and with entrance to various college and universities, such as highly selective, right? And so really taking the time to say, how have we done that? And as we maybe rethink our goals working forward, that we really are working from the lens of organizing and putting information together for kids so that they can look at it from both ways. I have a vision of a highly selective school. Here's the pathways I need to take and the courses I need, but here's what I want to study. And these are the pathways and the courses that I need to engage in. And really spending a little bit of time going into the research and making sure that we can summarize what are those evidence-based practices. So we have them in. Make sure that we conduct that gap analysis between evidence-based practices as well as comparable and aspirational districts and our District 303 comprehensive experience. And then we've got some future ISB graduation requirements that are kind of moving in over time, making sure that we've got ourselves all aligned and ready to roll. And a couple of them are going to impact things that we do at the middle school. So making sure that we've really thought through and made it clear how that could go. And then coming back with those recommendations and implementation timelines for each department's course pathways that align with evidence-based practice and that clearly connect with students' pathways for post-secondary success. Thoughts on the scope of the work?
Yeah, so for this one, it's starting out each department conducting an audit that includes the following, right? My concern is the charge statement doesn't address if we're missing departments, right? So for example, business education or computer science right now, some of the computer science classes I believe are under math, right? But if each department is a member of this committee and they're conducting an audit of their own department, right? How are we getting a comprehensive look at the catalog from other departments in our aspirational schools, other departments potentially that we may need to create towards career goals? That's my concern right now.
Yeah,
with
no,
this.
that's a fair question, and we can definitely kind of outline how what that would look like, and I really think that comes in a couple of places. I actually already had a conversation about this just in meeting with department chairs, wondering about this. And is it, is it in the right department? Two, should we add an additional department? So I do think that maybe thinking it from the lens of evidence-based practice and research, as well as what's happening in our aspirational districts, making sure, do we see anything here that is missing or not missing? And do we need to address it in some way?
Christine, I appreciate that. I would like to see like a big bullet.
Oh,
point
yeah,
for
I meant
this.
I was going to add one. I
Okay.
apologize that I
Got
would
it.
add a bullet.
Yeah, I will, like a big bullet point, because again, when we're looking at this catalog holistically, right? To Mr. Lackner's point, hasn't been updated 30 years, I mean, it's been, our curriculums, changed and improved and stuff like that. Our departments are still mired in the past, and there's some changes that we've experienced in the world. So I would like to really see that kind of prominently, because that's something that has been a big concern of the community
100%
as
correct.
well as myself.
We'll add that.
Yep, I can definitely add that piece.
So to tie into that, are there conversations with industry, with health? Things change, and education is slow to change. We just are. So is there, in your research, what is the future? I've seen many presentations about the future of work, and
Yeah.
and that led to us doing certain kinds of things, but things are changing pretty fast, and I get concerned that maybe even if we said, well, we need this kind of technology for our kids to have, and within 10 minutes it's gone. So how do we make sure that we're adjusting to what's
Yeah,
in the
I
work
think
world?
that will absolutely come out in the research, and I'm going to be very honest. I want to make sure I'm on the right track before I dive too deep. But I can say, in terms of that, one of the things we do see in the research really is that we need to be preparing kids for jobs that don't exist. And so what our focus really needs to be on is, how do I learn quickly? How do I change? How do I, those are the skills that our kids are going to need, because we can't really predict what that job might be for them.
I think there might be a more, I think all that's a good direction for us to go, and I think it should come out of the research. I think there are some local organizations that might want to weigh in. When you talk about the Fox Valley Career Center as an example, they have programs that feed local jobs. I wonder if a discussion with the Chamber of Commerce or a discussion with representatives of local unions might be other ways for us to gather information about what preparedness looks like, inclusive of the programs that are housed at Fox Valley. And I know there's a dual credit examination encapsulated in your bullet points here as well, which means conversation mostly with ECC. And maybe there is a discussion there, not necessarily about the course catalog that they offer, but almost the programmatic view of what are the biggest programs and how have they been evolving, just as another benchmarking point.
Sure, absolutely. We can absolutely do that. And we do work through, we have like employability standards that we work through. So we do have things that help kind of guide our pieces, but I love the idea of having a conversation with the Chamber of Commerce and work, to better understand what they're asking for.
So do we have it with the review, the holistic aspect that we're looking at, not just from an individual department, but all department chairs looking at it, but also bringing in other industry partners, chamber partners, and others to have that broader conversation and that ECC Fox Valley perspective. Okay, scope of work.
All right, so then the scope of the work kind of lays out how we'll be attacking that work, but these are the key questions that we're going to engage in to ensure that we, get to the right thing. And I heard a couple of things come up I think we should definitely add a question in here as it relates to future jobs and future.
Mhm.
I'm really lacking articulation right now, but I'll think about that. But something about what we were just talking about. How do we capture that, as well as what you were indicating to? A question that indicates that it's a holistic view and that we need to be thinking from the lens of what might also be missing and what maybe do we not need anymore?
I mean, along those lines, I mean, just as an example, pulling up our aspirational districts, going to the high school and looking at the departments and then just comparing it to our departments, right? Like at a base level, just looking and seeing like they have several departments, kinesiology, I probably butchered that, computer science, et cetera, that we may have pieces of offerings, but it's not in here, right? And there are additional, careers and other things that are a part of those. So at a base level, that's an expectation.
Absolutely. Well, I will add that in. What I will do is I'm going to take all your feedback. I'll kind of like we did with the AP audit. Put it back. I'll update it and then I'll send it out in a weekly.
Mhm.
Here it is. It's updated. If I don't, if you have feedback, I need it by this date. Otherwise, we're going to take this and go. So please know you'll get this is just to make sure I've got the right stuff. You'll get another opportunity to say, nope, you didn't quite capture what I was hoping for.
Well, the one thing I'd like to add is I know we're talking about things like Chamber of Commerce and Fox Valley and things. We have to remember that we're not preparing kids for careers in our neighborhood. So I think we need to kind of widen that scope as well and consider that there are careers and ideas, jobs that even people in our own Chamber of Commerce and our own Fox Valley Career Center aren't going to know about, but others maybe in the wider economic community would.
Okay.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions you'd like us to make sure we answer while we're working through
I
that?
was just going to add, since it came up a couple of times, that when I was taking a look at some of the aspirational districts, I did see a particular emphasis on like computer science, IT related. I think all that I checked at least had a department related to that. So it might be.
Yes,
an
we
offering.
definitely have already identified that as a need.
Thank you.
But thank you.
So one of the other key questions I'd like to add is we've heard a lot of feedback about the catalog, accessibility to it, and how we can communicate some of those pathways out. I'd like to put a line item in here for, are there any technologies that we can utilize to help facilitate communication with our community? So making the catalog available online to the community and at a high level, right? Our staff has done a wonderful job of trying to take our current catalog and our current departments, and they've got the little, I call it the bubble chart, right? That with the lines and the different courses and everything else. But then there's a lot of workarounds that we have to kind of, okay, I want to dive into what is this course? What is it prepping me for? How does it meet the state standards? All the great work that the teams have done now. So I'd love to see, kind of a question to help. Are there outcomes that we can help?
So I'm going to read one of the questions and
Yeah.
tell me if I haven't captured it in the question. It says, how can we develop a system that communicates early, clearly, and publicly the course pathways available for students and how they connect with post-secondary aspirations? Is it beyond that?
When I read that, I was reading a system like the district as a system. I wasn't thinking of it as a technology system because I think it is a system of how we as a district communicate the catalog. If we want to alter that one slightly and like, are there any additional technologies or other things that we can use to help facilitate?
I think I was thinking of that as like a component of how we might do that would be through technology, but do you want me to call that
I
out?
would love to have like some kind of call out on that piece of it in particular, because I think the district as a whole, right? I'm looking at the district as a system, right? From our, career counselors, our staff, everybody else who's guiding through, pathways, right? That's a system. This is more like here, how can we help enable them? Right. We heard about, when they were going through some of the feedback that we got of the notes that our teachers are taking to help point it out. Right. I'd love to be able to communicate some of those things out to parents. Hey, this particular piece of artwork that your daughter did today is fantastic. She should consider this other thing, or or whatever we can do to facilitate it. And again, I don't think there's something out there that's monolithic that would meet all of those things, but bringing some options to us.
I just want to clarify because I thought I had you and then you mentioned feedback. So are you talking about us being able to, and I'm also moving things all over here. Are we talking about putting the information about pathways into some type of technology, or are we talking about two-way communication between parents?
Both.
Okay.
Right, like, so I don't think this journey with the catalog ends once we've conducted this audit piece of it, right? I think this should be kind of a first step for us as a district of saying like, hey, here's the catalog, here's what we're missing, okay. Paul and the team identifying how do we get those things in, what the timeline looks like, right? But also then helping facilitate to our community of how do we utilize this, right? Because you're going to come back with some barriers, right? My guess is some of the barriers, and this is just what I've heard, I didn't even know that was offered, right? Or I didn't know that, that this level of feedback, I didn't know that my child was interested in it, right? Because again, our teachers are spending a bulk of their day with our children, right? They're the ones who are interacting. They're the ones who are getting to see a lot of these things, right? Anything that we can do as an organization to help facilitate some of that back, to help get the best, the most out of our children, would love to see.
So I'm wondering, that
Yeah.
feels like a big undertaking.
Totally.
The whole thing's a big undertaking, but that in particular also feels like a system process of how. Is it something that we can, when we're auditing, that's in our recommendations and not a timeline for implementation? I'm just thinking about the tight timeline here and wanting to do all the work well. That feels like that would be a lot of work to really unpack and understand all the different pieces to it. Could it be a next step?
I think
One of
so,
the-
because we have at least two things here. One is, do we have the appropriate courses and
Yes.
content? And the second issue is really, do we have the appropriate communication schema in place to inform
Yeah.
parents and students about that content and about that content's linkage to their aspirations? And so I think it is a next step, and it's an important one because it'll enable students to really engage with their aspirations and with the courses that will support those aspirations. So I think it's an important one. And I think just looking at the timeline that are timelines that come up in the next few slides, there's some ambition here, and it's aggressive. And so I appreciate getting the content. Do we have the appropriate content? And then getting the maturation of how we communicate about the availability of that content as, A and B.
I appreciate
And one of
that.
the things I think it starts with, as we just are having this discussion, is, as you've discussed, our counselors, our staff, they have done so much of this work. And so it could even start with some of the best practices. How do we navigate this catalog? Where are the pain points? Where are the challenges that they've found as they're having these career and or, academic discussions with these students? And I know they'd be helpful for me as a parent. I think they would certainly be helpful for the rest of our parents in our community. So maybe that's kind of where the starting point is having those discussions. And I believe you're already speaking to those folks and yielding their feedback just based off of what their experience has already been, right? I'd imagine they'll at least be loosely part of these discussions as
For
the
sure.
departments
For
start
sure.
to break
Yeah.
that down, and then how the counselors would be able to communicate that to the students. So it may not even be maybe as daunting as we think. I know it is quite a project, but the starting point, and correct me if I'm getting this messaging wrong, could be, where are those best practices? Where are we finding the best ways to navigate this? How are those discussions manifesting themselves
Sure.
with the students?
I guess I just want to make sure the goal, right, is the courses and the course pathways first, and second because in my head, I had that like kind of second.
You're right on that.
Okay.
Right. The courses are absolutely primary. And then there, to Mr. Lackner's point, there's definitely things out of it. You're going to tell us what are the roadblocks, what are the barriers, right? And how we address those barriers is going to be definitely a phase 2 to this.
So the question I have is as we discuss expanding, really what we're looking at is trying to expand the number of pathways, right? As we do that, do we have the administrative personnel? Do we have the management in place to know, first of all, are we, for example, autos and culinary, those things are very different pathways than college bound pathways. And so do we have the people in place with the expertise to be able to say, this is how this should be navigated and this is how this should be navigated because if we don't have that, I fear we're going to still have gaps.
I'll just finish up my thought there is, I think a lot of the times students certainly don't know exactly where they're going, don't know exactly what they're great at. And so resources that counselors and or the staff can share with parents, I think would be extremely valuable, especially as we streamline these processes and we know our pathways a little bit better. I think that would be helpful for those discussions that are happening with, 15 or 16-year-olds, like, I don't know what I want to study. I don't know where I want to go. And so the more we can provide those resources, I think the better.
And I'm not trying to be difficult, so
No.
please
Yeah,
know
I'm
that.
You're
not
not.
seeing it that way at all.
But I feel like they're two different things. One is what are we offering in our courses? The other one's about a comprehensive counseling program, which is how we work with kids to get there. So I
I
feel
think
like
so,
we just
Christine,
need to be clear about the two things.
you're already solutioning it. You've got it. You've got it. They're two different things.
However.
Just, I guess,
There.
I guess the feedback is answering these questions and a line on what are some other things, right, that are barriers or whatever that potentially you can bring to us for the phase 2. But we're, I think, trying to give you a glimpse of where we want to go next with this, right? And so as you guys are answering these kind of key questions, know that that's kind of the next place where we're going.
And I think the process, the initial process will also give rise to a lot of those solutions as we're navigating that. It will in part create some best practices because we're already deeply delving into the curriculum, into the pathways, and then we could be simultaneously building those resources that say, hey, this might be your pathway because we're really deep into that process. So I'm not trying to create additional work other than just saying that we might be able to create that while we're in the midst of that initial process.
I guess I've done a comprehensive counseling. That's not an easy task. And it really does sit outside of this. I mean, you have to have this to do that.
Correct.
I just want to be clear that I come back here with what you've asked me to do, but I also want to be realistic about what we can accomplish between now and April. That's all I'm trying to say.
So I have an ask about one of the questions.
Okay.
So, for instance, the biliteracy certificate, for kids to know about that and what that might open a door or two, would that fit in like the third bullet? How do we make sure that there are opportunities that they may not know you can accomplish this? We've been talking more about a lot of the careers, but there are also some things you need to, if you
Yeah.
do this, you're going to get into that highly selected.
I think that does kind of fall when you start to talk about going to highly selective school or a selective school, or when you put in a career that you might want, right? The seal of biliteracy would be a piece of the puzzle, depending on which one of those you're trying to attain. Am I
So-
making sense?
Yes, so in the audit, it would come up,
Mhm.
that kind of certificate or
Yeah.
some, getting your AA degree and your high school degree might do this. That would come
Yes.
up in that audit conversation.
Yeah.
Okay.
I believe so. Well, yes, biliteracy for sure.
Okay, do we have the right questions?
I'm gonna add a few in there, but.
Yep.
Okay. So kind of the process that we'll work through is we'll collaborate with principals, APs, and department chairs to complete the work. We'll focus on examining research to determine those evidence-based practices, really analyzing our SAT scores as well as the content in that SAT score to make sure that the courses that we're requiring kids to take are together. And then investigate practices and course pathways from comparable and aspirational districts so that we've really got a clear sense of what that kind of looks like over time. I did hear you add in having a conversation with chamber.
Yeah, kind of multiple perspective,
Yeah.
multiple lenses. Make sure that we're reviewing that in that process piece. I think that would be a good bullet there.
Is there any other things you want to make sure we accomplish through the process? All right, let's take a look at these deliverables. So, I maybe, when I read, which is why we do this, misunderstood the task at hand. I really thought it was to do kind of an audit and come up with an implementation plan. So I kind of chose to break them out in a couple of different ways. One was really to talk about what could be possible for next school year. And I pulled that kind of from the AP kind of piece, right? That there are some things that we want to be able to bring forward so that we can put in place for next school year. So coming in October, kind of talking through the CAI process and how that really leads to what goes into the course catalog, right? The course catalog just holds the information, but the process and the CAI is how things get into that catalog. We did an enrollment audit. So really kind of walk through, here's our enrollment, here's how these classes have been going, just so that we have that information and then recommend some of those changes. Particularly, I see them as it relates to those AP classes that we had kind of talked about earlier, and possibly maybe some courses we take off because for the last 5 years, nobody's enrolled. So that's kind of that first part. And then in January, kind of broke this down into kind of core versus non-core kind of focus. And really by January, coming back, kind of talking about here's our current state for our core classes in terms of our audit. Here's what it looks like. Here's what's happening in there. And also be able to bring back that vision for AP and dual credit. So if you remember when we did the AP audit, one of the things that we came up with was we really felt like we needed a vision for what this looks like. So if we can set that vision, we can then add that vision into the audit, right? Like, so that when we're doing and talking about what it is needs to be, we need to make sure it's aligning kind of with our overall vision across the way. So in January, kind of saying, here's what we think we see in our core classes, coming back in March with here's what some of those evidence-based practices are to kind of address some of those pieces. And then in April, coming back with here's some of the pathways we think we need to jump in and articulate out.
Dr. Igo, are these all, are you planning to bring these back to L&T committee discussions?
Yes,
Is that
I
what these dates are?
apologize. Yes, thank you for clarifying. I apologize.
For if we're missing departments, where do you see that fitting in that timeline?
Well, I think it will be, I don't have a real good answer for you on that one, other than it's probably in the non-core is what I'm guessing, right? We've got the 4 cores of ELA, math, science, social studies. The others would fall into that non-core arena. And then coming back in June, kind of outlining the current state of those non-core. So I'm kind of pushing the timeline, and I want to be really clear and transparent about that. But I also want to lay out why I think it's okay, right? And then August, really kind of describe what those pathways are, which would still put us in a spot to make some changes for the following school year, right? So no matter what, we won't be able to change any, because we have to have everything ready to roll by November of next year. So, but by pulling us a little bit further out, it allows us to be a little strategic and intentional in our focus in how we approach the work.
Can you help me understand the October deliverable that you have described, the October 2024 deliverable? It reads updated course catalog. Help me understand that.
Yeah, I'll be honest, I was trying to pull apart the November 23 deliverable that was listed into the goal, which indicated that we would have we'd come back with consideration for the upcoming school year. So review the high school by November to review and provide recommendations to the board that consider the advanced placement program and other programs, develop right. Like, so that I was just trying to be like, this is what I think you're asking me for.
Yeah, so I see some of that in the on the previous page in the October 23 deliverable, which is, I think, a great idea to bring back kind of the immediate things. I'm worried about this 24 date. And when I look at that, I say the updated course catalog. I expect that through the review that you do, you'll find that there might be things that we eliminate, but there will be some things that we could add within a year. There's some things that might take us some capability building or some asset investment in order to be in a position to offer some courses or to create some development. So when I look at that 24, it looks like an end date, but it doesn't feel like it.
Yeah, that's
end
a
date's
really
the right
good
thing.
point. Thank you for bringing that up. And I was kind of focused. You're 100% right. Because I anticipate kind of a multi-year implementation plan. So what that probably should say would be, I probably need to pull that all the way through for a couple of years where we'll be bringing back some updates. Hard for me to know exactly what that looks like, or maybe into the August I put in there, that will give you those pathways, but we'll also have a clear implementation over multiple years. I'm trying to identify like where not necessarily knowing what it would be, how to lay that out.
I don't have the timeline in my head exactly for the budget cycle, but it strikes me that once we're into June of 24 and we start to see where some of the requirements for new courses, especially, or things that are great departures from what we might have today, might affect the budget cycle, we probably have to make sure that before we hit that finalized September budget, we're at
That's
least
fair.
holding a chunk for those
Yes.
investments.
Yes, I concur.
And hiring and certification.
Yeah, and it may be that following cycle. To your point, we have to think about that budget, because by August, we're pretty baked. The staff has already been hired, everything. So it's really that following school year.
Yeah,
Yeah,
so even though it says October 20, that would be,
Yeah.
but it would go into effect the
But I'm glad-
25-26 school year, right? Because that's what the kids would be
Correct.
registering for.
correct.
So just for clarity, for my own sake, so let's say hypothetically, we did determine that a new department was needed. So in addition to new classes and so forth, how big of a lift would that be? How long does that take? How far out do we need to be planning for that, not only financially, but staffing, as Mrs. McCabe just mentioned? How long would that process take, especially if we're seeing something that is critical, like a computer science or something
Yeah.
along those lines? How big of a lift? How long does that take?
Hard to say, kind of depending on what it is exactly, like computer science, we kind of have that on our radar. This currently sits in our math department, right?
Mhm.
So is it about what can we do within the math department to build out while we add something? Do you know what I mean? There's a couple of ways we could come about that, or before we could separate out, but we wouldn't certainly want to let something sit, but not knowing what might be missing. Hard for me to really answer that question.
Right. So it strikes me we would need to determine the vision first, right? Do we think this is necessary?
Yes.
And if we do, then start doing those incremental steps to do so.
Correct.
But it sounds like it's a bit of a lift, because if it is an
It's a huge
entirely
lift.
new department, we have a new department chair, we have new staffing and so forth.
Yes.
Kind of goes back to that original piece of making sure that we see this from a holistic viewpoint. What are those pieces we have? What are those pieces we're missing? And then that next piece is laying it out and saying, okay, for this one, it may be a smaller lift, but these other ones, that's a 2 to 4 year lift. I think that will be that recommendation coming back to the board as well.
So I wonder if I need to adjust this in some way.
I think
If,
sorry, I was just going to add for 1 second. So I think if that recommendation comes sooner, right, then it's a lot easier for us. If we're recognizing early on in the process, we need this. And then, like you said, it might take a year, 2 years, depending upon how many that we're adding. But I think if we recognize it early on by, like you were already doing,
Mhm.
checking out what our aspirational districts are doing, I think being aware of that would be a
Yes.
huge asset early on. So,
I understand there's a lot of work in the analysis that you've laid out here, and I appreciate that. I think the way I would reinforce Mr. Kushert's statement is that if there are some obvious wins that you identify early, let's start the discussion at the board table about what it would take to make them happen, so that maybe we don't have to wait till the very end to implement
100%.
those.
Absolutely, we'll do that as we see. I mean, this has actually been a really I have enjoyed my toe into this while trying to understand it. I've started to do some work that there's lots of really great opportunities here. So we will be back to the table when if we see something that we could do, that we feel strongly about that could help.
Along those lines, can we put you go back to the previous slide, can we put a checkpoint earlier to get, kind of that if there are some obvious wins, or just even statusing on it?
We can absolutely do statusing.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Just going back to the October 23 headline, course recommendations. I do think we need to take out the 24, 25, so we're not locking ourselves in, but it's more of that ongoing to all of your
Yeah.
points, that there may be something that we update sooner. Others are going to be much later.
Right.
I think this is gonna be fun.
It is. I'm actually looking forward to it. I gotta be honest.
Everything else okay within the deliverables then? Okay,
Right. I will update this and get it into the board packet, hopefully by Friday.
All right, wonderful. Well, even more great discussion there. I think that takes us on to item 2C, increasing student achievement for underperforming students.
Show tonight, in case you're wondering.
thank you.
Thank you very much.
All right, so very similar to the last, this is really an opportunity for us to just make sure we get some clarity, make sure that we're on the same, like we're working in the same way. So a goal that you had set really was around analyzing and identify the root cause and develop an action plan to address underperforming Hispanic and English language student cohorts across D303. And that deliverable was by November of 2023 that we'd be ready to recommend an action plan to improve student learning that includes an implementation timeline. That was kind of the goal that you set, which is why I'm also kind of saying there's a lot of work going on. And like, I want to make sure that we give ourselves plenty of time to do that. So again, I'm really just going to walk through that process in the same manner that I did the last one. I'm hoping to I clearly just copied this over, research consensus as it relates to this, to its purpose, scope of the work, key questions, process, and deliverables. This really does, again, push us back into building those different pathways, making sure that they're there and available to us. And again, leaning into those core values to help us make those decisions. Here is really the, as we look through this instructional coherence, this is where that lies. But this really hits at the bottom around equitable systems of support. So if you look at our action steps, there was an action step that related to making sure we dug in and understood our EL services and how do we provide supports. So it's really kind of hitting, we're going to talk a lot about this guaranteed and viable curriculum, but it's also about equitable systems of support. All right, so let's take a look. So we have a purpose statement here. Really to develop a comprehensive action plan to improve learning outcomes for our multilingual learners and our Hispanic students. Does that hit the goal? It's a pretty straight. All right. So looking at that root cause kind of hypothesis that you asked us to dive into, we really thought about where are we currently at. Most of you were here when we did our equity audit. So we did really kind of lean back into what is in those reports. That's not to say we might not come back and say, here's another one or another thing, but as we really read through those equity reports and thought through, we felt like the message was clear, right? The message really was around inconsistent expectations of rigor within our classrooms, right? Which we have identified, or that was identified as being caused by a lack of common definition and understanding of proficiency, common priority standards, and understanding of what's essential within each of those grade levels, and then those district-wide systems that support the consistent use of formative assessments to drive instructional decisions. So that's kind of like, that's really everything that we do, but it also really hits hard here as well. And so you're going to hear us, as we've been working through, kind of thinking through that the lens, not across everywhere, but as we're thinking through this is really what is happening in that general ed classroom and what are we doing to provide services and supports within that general ed classroom to support students. That's really at the root cause. We do a lot to intervene or pull out, but the reality is kids spend 95% of their time in the gen ed classroom. And so have we done enough to make sure that best first time instruction is in place? And what might that look like? We also know that we have policies, procedures, and practices that are creating unintended barriers to student learning. So we want to dig at those and see what those look like. We also know that we've got inconsistent services and programs between schools and levels. And then this idea that we focus on, we've done a lot of work around intervention and remedial instruction, but we really want to be thinking about what's our best first time instruction.
So that policies, procedures, and practices bullet it seems very big. right? Especially for this hypothesis. Do we have an example policy that kind of helped us formulate this hypothesis? Because again, back to your point earlier, like when we're talking about the gen ed and everything else, that is there something in particular? Because there's all, as a district, we have a lot of policies.
Yeah,
Right.
so I'm speaking very specific to this particular, looking from the lens of our multilingual learners and our Hispanic students. Do we have a policy, a practice, or a procedure that might be creating an unintended barrier for our students in accessing? I don't have an answer because we're still digging at that, but from the lens of, might we have something in place?
Okay.
We
this
might
is-
be fine. But we need to look.
Well, agreed, but that's where it's again, as a student through the journey, right? If a Hispanic student going through the journey, right? Like it's every policy we have would potentially applies most, right? So are we examining all the policies, or because again, if it's part of our hypothesis, right? Is there something that we think is there that's like, hey, we got to look at this policy in particular, like for example, how we've centralized some of the learning, right? And we have to bus all the students from across the district to a single place, right? Is there something that's there that's caused it to be there? And if you don't, right, I want to be administration to be careful on taking on like examining like everything. That's it, right?
Well, I think that if you're going to look at root cause, you have to be ready to look at everything. And so I'm more about the hidden rules than I am about the policy. But some policies may have barriers that we didn't recognize until we look at the research of what a multilingual student needs to have, or a student who doesn't get to walk to school, or a student whose parents don't speak English. There are a whole bunch of issues that you have to unpack, and we go, well, we got this policy. So it should be part of the audit. It may all be, I figure the policy's gone through press, so it's legally looked at and all of that. But there may be something that we didn't recognize was a barrier to certain groups of kids or families or teachers or classrooms that may be something we have to rethink. We may be lucky and all our policies are good, but our hidden rules and procedures are wrong.
Honestly, I don't
that's what
have
was gonna
anything,
say.
a policy in mind, but I think we need to be open to that. It's really more about our procedures and practices.
I think that the
Got it.
resources are also going to give rise to that, right? If we are seeing inefficient resources or lack of resources
Right.
altogether, that's going to lead to inadequate procedures and practices and internal policies at any one individual school, as opposed to, as you're talking about, kind of unilaterally doing things consistently across the board.
Good conversation. Scope of work.
Scope of the work. So this kind of lays out kind of the pieces again, really making sure that we know and understand the students that we serve. And who are our multilingual learners, we have many Hispanic students who are not multilingual learners, a significant amount, but they're still underperforming. So why is that, right? We need to know who we serve and how we're serving them. We need to analyze the different types of services that we have. We need to conduct an audit of our current state with really a big focus on curriculum instruction, the learning environment, as well as those practices, procedures, policies to understand the learning experience for our kiddos who are underachieving, then really doing the review of the research to identify those high impact strategies, and then develop a comprehensive action plan, and then identify how we can leverage our PLC learning cycle to ensure high levels of learning for all. So one thing that we're really focusing on in all that we do is that PLCs is what we've decided is how we change and make things better for kids. So that means everything we do goes through the PLC learning cycle. And so we should always be thinking about how are we leveraging that to get the results that we want over time. Is there anything we feel like we need to add or change as it relates to this?
I'm wondering where economics might fit in. Do you think that's going to bubble up?
Yeah, so if you look at the bottom of this piece. So in the equity audit on page 2, like bottom half of the page 2, I've got like the data to be analyzed down there. We do take a look at what is our free and reduced lunch population as it relates to whether I'm a multilingual learner, whether I may be a Hispanic student, right? Because we know in our equity audit, one of the things that was called out to us was that we have an overrepresentation of our free and reduced lunch students are also Hispanic. But if you remember, what he also called out in that was, but regardless, when we just look at free and reduced lunch, like it might not be a Hispanic, it might be a poverty issue. It might be at the heart of it. I can't remember, he said it much more eloquently than I did, but essentially what he was saying is we're seeing the same issues, whether the student, if you qualify for free and reduced lunch, we're seeing the same underperformance regardless of your race or your ethnicity.
That's what I was going to mention there is that where are the resources lacking or spread too thin? If there's a higher proportion of the students that need those resources and we're spreading those resources out thin because 20%, just to throw out an arbitrary number, require it as opposed to another school that only have 5% that requires those resources. And we would be wise to consider the fact that those resources are being spread way too thin. And
I like
naturally
that.
would
So
impact-
adding that in,
Yes.
does that go here?
Or
Or on a key
I was
question?
having trouble finding where that would
More of
go.
the question.
I think it might be a
it's
good key question for us to
like-
be asking as we walk through this process.
Especially if we're identifying that as a causal
Yeah.
link,
Yeah,
then we need to look at that proportion from school to school. I think it should be probably considered for a guiding principle. For
Yeah.
SPA.
how are we utilizing our resources and are they aligned in the right places is what I think I'm hearing you saying.
That's what I heard.
Anything else as it relates to the scope of the work?
Good.
Good. Okay, let's take a look at key questions. And this really, again, is that focused on what needs to be within our core curriculum to make this happen? What current practices do we need to have in place? What models for multilingual learners align with evidence-based practices? Are students learning English and content at the expected rate across time? Again, how are we leveraging our PLC learning cycle to support students, including those in the dual language program, as well as our Hispanic students who are underachieving? Are there additional resources that need to be in place to support high levels of learning? And then what policies, practices, or procedures do we need to adjust to make sure that our students can access and perform at a high level?
Can we also add a question of identifying why people might be refusing services if they are eligible?
Okay.
Dr. Igo, in the fourth bullet, you talked specifically about students who are participating in the dual language programs. And I want to build on Mr. Kuchert's point about resource allocation differences. And I know that you have some other, that you're going to add something there, but I wonder if there are other highly correlated program participation that says, for example, students who participate in this program tend to have these other characteristics and tend to be underperforming. And if that leads us to examination of those programs and the efficacy of those programs, I think that'd be a really positive outcome.
Yeah.
So we talk about dual language here. We talked about resource allocation. A lot of times that resource allocation comes in terms of program participation. So I would like to see if it comes up that there are other programs that are highly overlapped with the students with higher opportunities to perform. Let's take a hard look as a follow-on into those programs.
Absolutely.
I have 3 pieces and I have no idea if they belong in the audit. One of the things, and this comes from my experience in another life. So the assessments, the statewide assessments of EL students are the whole thing has been set up that the students who are identified as EL, when they exit, there's a little time of follow-up, but as long as you are identified as EL, you will not be proficient because you have to be able to take the assessment in English, but you are an EL student who is still learning English. So if there is assessment issues I think the board and the community should be aware of it. Because I think that there has been the assumption that if a student is not a native English speaker, they will not perform, they can't perform well. No matter what program people need to know that the assessment is set up in a way that we have to give kids time to be proficient. Does that make sense? And am I a decade old in my knowledge?
I think what I'm hearing you say is we know kids take 5 to 7 years to acquire English, but we require them to take the state assessment in year 2, right? Newcomers don't take it in year 1, but we require them to take it in year 2, which puts kids at a significant disadvantage because they haven't quite learned English. And so it's really hard for them to access the content. Is that what you're trying to?
Yes.
Yes.
But I would strengthen it by saying being biliterate. They may be able to speak English, but to be able to write and answer questions is a
Yeah. So I'm wondering if the question you're really, I want to be careful, right? Like, yes, it's a hard assessment, if you're not a native English speaker, but I don't want to say kids aren't going to perform
Right,
or that we
right.
can't help kids do it, right? Like, me, I'm a big believer that we can.
right.
But I also wonder if maybe the question you're asking me really is about kind of access scores. And like we have a real clear picture of kids and where they are, in terms of where they are in their journey on literacy and what happens when kids are farther down that journey versus when they're just entering that journey, and how might that impact the assessment?
So
What other assessment data points
Yes,
potentially
Right.
could tell the story about our students?
correct. Like one of the things, like, again, I'm just speaking. One of the things we don't do that I think we absolutely need to be doing in dual language is that we need to be assessing in both English and Spanish, right? Like we should know where kids sit, which tells us a lot more about what they're gaining or not gaining, which allows us to make inferences than about the IAR.
So, yes, so if there's a way to figure out that assessment piece, because I think that will also strengthen our look at how students are progressing and as well as how the community sees multilingual students.
100%.
Okay.
Like, yes. So
The
I
other-
think you're asking me to add a question in about how can we utilize assessments to
Yes,
better monitor kids' progress in both English and in content areas.
because we don't tend to talk about the access assessment.
Yeah,
at the
you're
board
100%
table.
right.
Okay.
You're 100% right.
The other piece I have is about special education and multilingual students. And is that a barrier for that?
Yeah,
we
so
should-
that is one of the pieces. And when you look at who are the students that we
Yeah.
serve, one of the questions we're asking is that IEP piece. And we're really going to take a hard look too, and Cindy's already started, are like those long-term ELs, right? Like that's, who are those kids that are long-term ELs and why are they long-term ELs? And what does that look like?
There's another, and this is my last question, there's another piece. And I don't know, I don't know our students well enough to know. There's a real difference from when students come and have no English, so the newcomers who come to our district. But we also have families where Spanish is spoken at home, but the students speak English.
Many of our
And,
families,
pardon me?
many of our kids.
Yes,
families,
and
we have
that becomes, and I think you might find that in why people are not accepting the program, or there was a lot of research about students who are where they don't know how to speak their family's native language and what that does to a family. That can be really difficult. So I'm wondering if you need to dig into, we've got the majority of our kids, or we have a percentage of our kids who have both English and another language, but in school because that could be a hindrance, a barrier. I don't know.
I think, there was a time when we didn't necessarily embrace that. And now as a school district, we understand the value of, well, if a student might be living in a household that speaks a lot of Spanish, and maybe the student speaks mostly English, they still understand Spanish. And so making and leveraging their knowledge in that second language and bridging to English is still in the research, the strongest thing that we can do for kids. So, I think what you want us to be aware of, and I think we are very aware of our students. We don't have students that come in a lot of the time that have never been exposed to English, right? Like that they have had some exposure, but they still need explicit instruction in Spanish and they still need explicit instruction in English, and we still need to be bridging those two languages for them. Did I answer that? Yeah.
Yeah, I think we are not a newcomer community. My understanding is our housing is more costly. And so families who've been in.
You might be surprised.
Yeah, you're gonna be
Okay,
surprised.
You're gonna be surprised. Okay. I would put us in a newcomer community.
Yeah.
Okay.
Some of our Davis friends, if they're still in the crowd. If
In
they're
the last
numbers.
couple of years, we've seen a significant increase in
Yeah.
newcomers. Any other key questions to consider? We're just taking a look at our process, really is digging into and leaning into the equity audit and the strategic plan. So you remember we had an equity committee. That equity committee eventually leaned into, and we used a lot of the work in the equity committee to support putting together the strategic plan. So making sure that we're leaning into that, analyzing 5 years of our student achievement data, and then evaluating our current practices, services, and programs in relationship to evidence-based practices, really with that focus on curriculum instruction and learning environments, as well as policies, procedures, and practices as appropriate.
So in the deliverables, a couple of thoughts.
Is this where you are?
Yeah, sorry.
Okay, no, you're good.
The comprehensive report in November, you have a nice outline here. That's only 60 days from now. And
Yes.
a couple of different thoughts on that. I expect, not speaking for the board, but knowing the board, the discussion around the comprehensive report around analysis will raise a lot of questions. And while I appreciate the admin bringing forward recommendations, and I think you should, I suspect that those recommendations will end up as draft recommendations, given the board's penchant to take a look at the analysis. And then when we talk about action plans, I'm hopeful that coming out of those draft recommendations, we'll also have some expectation around the, bread box or battleship size budget implications of those recommendations, because there might be 100 things we'd like to do, and we might be in a position to do 10. So we want to make sure we're picking the best, most impactful 10.
Yes, actually, I appreciate that. We had kind of talked about, we need to keep it to what we know is when we focus and we pick 3 to 4 things, we can do them well and then kind of come back and say, now what? So, but I appreciate that. So thank you.
So to piggyback off that and actually a point that Mrs. McCabe made, if we're doing this in a couple of months, 60 days, I believe you said.
I'd prefer you not say it that way.
Yeah. Well, we'll say in a long time from now, how do we plan for or account for the discussion we were just having? Where is the language barrier and where's the academic barrier, right? As we're seeing, we're trying to identify root cause. How do we account for that? How do we measure that without having assessments in native languages or things like that?
So we'll do it a couple of different ways. We do look at and know that, our kids tend to be acquiring English, but maybe not acquiring content knowledge. And we do that by looking at our access data and aligning that with what we're seeing in our iReady data and what we're seeing. And we do some in terms of we just haven't really found the right system to do assess in Spanish. So we've had a couple that haven't really given us where we wanted to be, but we're continuing to kind of roll through that process to make sure we have something strong in place. But we do use those things, and you'll see that in our analysis when we bring it forward.
So should access come to us more often?
Probably. I mean, in true, it should, yes. The answer is yes. And it probably should be in the student achievement report is probably where it would belong.
I mean, it
Yeah.
is It's a group, it's a critical,
You're
and it's
100%
really, is it still as good an assessment as it was when it?
gives us information.
Yeah.
It's information that we have about kids that that we use to inform instruction, and there is no reason really that we don't have it included. We should, yes, I'm just gonna say yes and put it in the student achievement report and when we get there.
Okay. Do we have that charge statement?
We're good to go. I'll update that.
Yep.
Okay. All right, we're making slow, steady progress, friends. We're almost there.
Emphasis on slow.
Okay, well, I think that brings us to item 2D, Student Achievement Report Format Discussion. We've got a nice thick packet here to talk about. So Dr. Igo, take it away.
So, yeah, so we gave you a copy of the last one, just so that you were able to follow along and kind of see what we did last year. So last year, we spent a significant amount of time really rethinking the student achievement report, reorganizing it, re-putting it together. And I felt like we got to a place where we all felt pretty comfortable with where we are. Clearly, we missed a big piece, access, but we're going to find out where that goes. But as we kind of walk through, I want us to, as we start to walk down the road of putting this together for this year, make sure that we're in a good place. Like, yes, I think that we're in a spot of tweaks versus rehaul, but of course, open to all feedback and recommendations as we move forward. But our goal really is around making sure we got consensus around purpose, the data we're going to include, how we're going to analyze that data, the organization, and then the information that we're going to keep in our appendix. So if this is kind of like,
Question for you. I'm sorry, before we move forward. So on the website, we have November 2022 and February 2023 for both the community and for the board. Do you want us referencing
the
November report?
Yes.
Okay.
So the February was just our update, our mid-year update. You guys can't hear me talk about that anymore tonight. So let's just talk about the purpose. So last year we had identified the purposes to analyze the district's progress towards meeting both the 2023 benchmark and the 2025 goals. Continues to be appropriate, I believe, so that we would describe the recommendations and action steps for improving student learning, making progress towards, this is slightly different, the strategic priorities and the success indicators. So last year we really did not necessarily focus on that. So I think we go back to, and we continue to focus on, we have those benchmarks, where are we at and how are we progressing towards those benchmarks? But then when we get into what are the recommendations and action steps, we start to align that with what we've got in our strategic plan in terms of strategic priorities and making progress towards our success indicators. And then including in that, that's anticipated curriculum and instruction updates. And then of course, the overall purpose really is around communicating our current state of student achievement within our community. Have I captured the purpose? Anything we want to change or move?
Board thoughts here?
Good.
Sounds like we got it.
Sounds good.
All
to me.
All right, so let's kind of talk about the achievement data. So this was something we added last year. This was the on-track indicators. So this was kind of like the dashboard that started the report. That kind of just talked about where we are. And it was kind of in the executive summary where this was specifically related to the benchmarks that we set and where we were and how we were falling on those benchmarks. I continue to think that this would be something appropriate that we would want to have in our report to allow a quick kind of steady update.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. All right. So when we get to the analysis of our data, well, really, again, last year, we made a change from kind of describing the data and then interpreting the data to just interpreting the data. So we kind of did it in bullet points and we interpreted the data in relationship to those 2025 goals. And then this year we'll talk about them in terms of strategic priorities and success indicators. Really identifying recommendations and action steps to improve our outcomes, and then highlight for you any curriculum updates that are occurring this school year so that you can make some of those connections.
You know,
Does that continue to be appropriate?
Yeah, one thing I was thinking about is, does it make sense to populate on the SAR itself, like our percent improvement year over year? Is that something from like a 5-year perspective that would be helpful as we're seeing presumably the increased performance in each of those areas? Or does it muddy up these graphs too much?
Well, maybe, but I think we could absolutely put something in, and maybe I'm thinking like, if you look at page 16 of the student achievement
Yeah, that's where I
report,
was.
right? That's a little bit farther down, but where we look at all of the pieces, right?
Yeah.
We could also, we do, I mean, we calculated, we know what the change is by cohort, and we know what the change is by grade level. So it might be a little hard to read. We can play around with it.
Yeah.
And if we can't make it look good on here so that it's an easy read, we could easily put it into the appendix
Right.
so that people could see that.
I just think it might be nice to see a snapshot of that year over year improvement, and we can see big jumps or lulls in the data or whatever might help us draw some inferences about what's working and what isn't.
Yeah, which is more, yeah, I mean, when we write it up, we definitely discuss, like, when we interpret the data, we do it that way. So it makes sense that you would be able to see that as well.
In that, I think that this is an appropriate time to mention it. We have the goals reflected in a table in the appendix, and they're often absent from some of the detailed analysis. And so they're referenced often in the body of descriptive text that matches the tables, but they're parked way back in the back in the appendix. And these are our, as we know from our last mid-year discussion, some pretty aggressive aspirations for the district. And so one thing we might consider would be not only to pull those forward into the front, but also to say we have the opportunity to have many of them reflected in the tables as comparative points. So as you get into slides like you'll see on 11 or even earlier in page 7, when we talk about things like district compared to national norms, we have goals for these. Many of them, maybe not all of them, but for many of these, we have goals. And so it might be
To add it right.
Yeah,
in.
just to add it right there,
Yeah.
so we know the distance.
Yeah, I like it.
We're going.
That's a good suggestion.
I'm going to add it in charts where it's applicable, right?
Yes.
We can do that. I'm just gonna move us through this piece, and then you stop me at any point in time, but I'm gonna talk through that because some of you're kind of walking down here. So the way we organized the report last year is we really did start with graduates of District 203, and we looked at 5 years of data, and we looked at their post-secondary enrollment, their graduation rate, their SAT super score, and then we also specifically pulled out the class of 2022. So we'll call out the class of 2023 and hit those college and career readiness indicators and post-secondary plans so that we've got a good handle on where are our graduates over time, and specifically what can we talk about in terms of the class that just graduated. And that really falls into their graduation rate, their average SAT, college and career readiness per college board, how much early college credit they earned, and then where they went when they were done that class, 4-year college, 2-year college, military, gap year, things like that. Does that still continue to be appropriate?
Do you think we should add, it won't be a percentage, but it'll be a number of kids who are coming out with both an AA and a high school? Is that worth sharing?
I don't know. Let me look into that to see what that number is and how many kids take advantage of
Well,
it.
it's under 10.
It's under 10. Okay. Would you like
But-
me to add that then?
Well, I'm thinking that it's quite an accomplishment.
No, you're not wrong.
And I think that would be something that the community should see is available to students. Along with the biliteracy, is that I think has been growing, the certificate.
So in the graduating class, when I talk about the class of 2023 this year, add in the students who graduated with a high school diploma and an associate's degree, and the number of students who also graduated with the seal of biliteracy.
Yeah, and I don't know, maybe we want national, is it getting too much? In national honor? we don't, you know, this is just. These are just numbers, but when we see what kids are actually accomplishing, is that something that, I don't know, does the board care? I think for from somebody who doesn't have kids in school, and I'm looking at what our kids are accomplishing, there's a lot that goes on that if you go to the awards night, you'll know it, but you won't see it anywhere else.
Well, certainly, Mrs. McCabe, for when I look at the purpose statement, bullet number 3, in terms of the overall progress and the current state of student achievement, those are good
Yeah.
descriptive
Yep.
elements.
So we're talking page 7 and 8 to be able to find,
Yes, yes. I also want to be careful that I don't overpromise. So I'm not sure if I've got something I can compare that to. Like, can I find a national average of kids who earn an associate's degree in high school? I might be able to, just in case. Like I will put our numbers in. I just can't guarantee that I'll have something to compare it to.
I see what you're talking about. I'm not necessarily asking how do we compare to the nation?
Oh, you just want to know in general?
Yes.
Oh.
as I
sure.
did, it looks like more on page 8.
Yeah, I could add
That page 8 would be
post-secondary
the
or
one that I would put
graduating
it on.
class of, yeah, for sure.
When it aligns with our initiative to increase college
Yep.
credit, so.
Yeah,
think
I have
it's
no
worth it.
problem doing that. I was more concerned
Yeah,
about what I was
definitely not
comparing it
7.
to.
Definitely not page 7, but definitely page 8.
Fair enough. All right, so once we talked through the graduates, then we talked about that foundation of learning, which is the climate and culture. And so in that, we really looked at attendance. We looked at our attendance data. We looked at our sense of belonging data. And I think we would continue to do that. And we really focused in on those areas like 3, 5, 8, 11, focusing in on when kids transitioned, because that was where the research really was. Does that continue to be where we want to be? Kind of moving into ELA and math proficiency. This is really looking at state accountability measures. So that's the IAR and the SAT and the DLM are the 3 state assessments. We would look at both proficiency and growth. So right, proficiency is the first one in there. And then we also get growth from the kids who hit their percent of kids who hit the growth target. So we'll continue to include that. And then we'll look at student group data for 2023. We also included advanced courses for math, number of kids that had Algebra 1 and the number of kids who had Algebra 2 before graduating, before entering high school, and then before their senior year. Continue to put that in. No questions. All right. Once we did ELA and math proficiency, we went to college and career readiness. And there we had freshmen on track, early college credit as it relates to AP and dual credit. We talked about GPAs of kids at successful transitions, right? That was grade 6, 8, and 12. And then we also talk about enrollment in advanced courses. Any questions about that? And then last year, we really hit this idea about cohorts that were most impacted by the pandemic. And so we've got the current class of 25, 26, 27, and 2033. Some of those kids, some we released last year. Remember when we did the mid-year update, they were on track. We said no more. I think this is a good opportunity for us to come back, take a look. Hopefully we're going to say they're back to where they were pre-pandemic and we're feeling good, or we're going to continue to monitor them over time. Do we still want that information?
I would say until it's clear that they're not negatively impacted or that they've gone back to pre-pandemic levels, I think that would be wise.
I concur. Wanted to make sure that we're good. And then within the additional data, the information we had in the appendix was the school report card ratings for each school. We had the district IAR and SAT scores by grade level. We had the IAR and SAT data by school and by grade level. We had top 10 colleges that overall as a district over the last, I think it was like 2014, like over the last 8 years, we'll drop one out and pull one up. And then we'll talk about the class of 2023. And then we will also include those AP scores by high school and by course. And we have that by percent of students earning a 3, 4, or 5, and mean, median, and mode is also included on that chart.
Will that be by exam and by class?
Mhm.
right? Okay.
Yep.
That's what I thought.
And that brings us to the end of the student achievement report. Do we feel like we need to make any additional adjustments? I heard the benchmark pieces. I had the additional data. I think that's fantastic. Are there any other things you'd like us to do or put into place?
I'll just bring up a brief topic we chatted about a couple weeks ago when we were talking a little bit about the state in-house data for the students for the SAT, where it's taken, I think, the preceding April for the graduating class, right? So you have the two sub scores that give rise to the composite
Mhm.
scores. So I was looking at some of our aspirational districts and they do in fact, some of them, I didn't look at all of them, but do in fact populate that data, not only in some of their, in their SAR, but also in their presentation, and then also included on some of their school profiles, which you and I have chatted a little bit about what should and should not be in a school profile. And then I suppose the other question I would have would be the amounts of times the exam has been taken. Is that noteworthy? Should we be noting that based on class, and we can anticipate that for future years? So, 646 students took the SAT twice, right? Or they took it 3 times. And I
What
know that there's-
information does that, what are we hoping to, what question are we trying to answer?
I think we can garner a little bit of interest info regarding how many times students need to take this examination to be successful or to meet that standard mean that we're trying to meet. So, and again, I can show you some examples of some of the other districts that showcase this information. I guess I'm just opening up for discussion if we feel that would be important. To your point earlier, it's data that we already have. Right? We're
Yeah,
keeping
it's
all
not,
that data,
not,
so I
not
just-
necessarily,
Right.
yeah, as long as we understand what question it's answering,
Mhm.
right? Like, I think most of our kids take it more than once. And
Right.
so I think that's a piece that to know. And I think they take it more than once for many, many reasons. And it's not always, like, sometimes it's like, if I get another 10 or 20 points, that's another, I hit the scholarship line. You know what I mean? So just knowing that we can give you that information, but we might not know what inspired somebody to take it in assessment more than once.
I think the data alone is meaningful, but I agree with you. We wouldn't necessarily know exactly why they did. Presumably, it would be to improve their score. I mean, I would
But for
assume that
which
that would be,
purpose, right?
the
Yeah.
fundamental reason.
So the number and
Yeah.
the number of students who took.
How many
SAT,
times the students
and
take.
then how many times they took
Yep.
the.
And I can show you some pretty
That'd
clean
be good.
examples of how it was shown to the public and to the board.
As we discussed this last time, I'm gonna just throw this in again, that I think that it demonstrates the benefit of perseverance. So,
Okay.
and
You
that's
got
something I
that.
think we should be encouraging as a district.
Okay, hearing none other,
Any other thoughts here, board?
SAR is set.
I'll forward along those examples for you just for your guys.
Yeah, that would be helpful.
Sure.
Christine's show is now officially done.
It was a show.
All right. Well, that was a wonderful discussion. Thank you, everyone. Really appreciate it. I think that takes us to agenda item 3A. Do we have future agenda items we need to discuss?
Probably can't think of any at this point.
I think we may have covered that already throughout our discussion. Which,
Oh, we've got a lot of upcoming agenda items. I think we saw that, right?
well, again, thank you
We've got
very
Spanish
much.
language arts and the vision coming at the next meeting for sure. And laying some groundwork as it relates to multilingual learners as well.
Well, we appreciate the hard work from the administration and these thorough presentations for us to review and evaluate. And thanks a lot for the discussion from the board. That brings us to adjournment at